Let me kind of set this up for you accordingly. Imagine a situation where you're living in an environment where you know that there are literally water fountains, doors, businesses, establishments that clearly has a line in the sand that tells you white people over here, color people over here. So you automatically know that you're in a situation where if you notice that there's a nice clean water fountain in the white area and the black or the colored people area was really nasty, you know what that's signaling to you. It's signaling to you that your well-being is not as important. You better just be happy you have water. You also know that if you have to go on a bus, you're expected to sit in the back of the bus. You also know that if you're going into a business establishment, there's probably a door that specifically you have to go into. And more importantly, you also know that if there is a particular environment where you're told that you're not welcome, if it says something like whites only, you know exactly what's going to happen if you walk through that door where it says that. You know if a town says, if it's been brought to your attention that a town is a sundown town, you know exactly what that meant. That meant you always knew where the clear and present dangers were. Because not only did you have the institutions telling you this, not only did the laws set up this, it was also permeating within the culture. You knew where the dangers were. Because there was no need to be confused when you walked into a space and you saw whites only and you were the only black person there. So you knew something hostile was about to happen. If you knew you walked into a side door, or if somebody there told you you're not allowed to sit there, all of a sudden you know that if you didn't do what you needed to do to correct that behavior right away, you knew what was going to happen next. All of that was clear. And we often overlook the fact that when we see the depictions in history about, oh, this is a white person's only black person, we totally jump over the fact that if you didn't move the right way, violence would happen. So if you happen to walk through the door and all of a sudden you weren't supposed to be there, the response to you being in that space a lot of times was violent. They violently would put you back in your place, and nothing would happen to the people for doing that. And I think that often gets lost in the discussion. So there was no confusion about where your place was and no confusion about what would happen to you if you didn't stay in your place. That was the land that we had before us at that particular period of time. Now take that for a second and say to yourself, okay, the institutions are this way, the laws were this way, the attitudes were this way. Now we've changed the laws. So the laws no longer are that way. The laws have now compelled the businesses to no longer be that way. We've also created laws that are going to punish you if you act a particular way. You got all that. And now you've got a new generation of kids who are being raised by people who were used to knowing where the racism and bigotry and discrimination was, to now raising kids to not know where it was. The sad part is that you have people telling them to their face, oh, you don't have to worry about it now. We finally made a change to bring us all together. Yeah, a lot of people didn't get that memo. So now we've gone to a time when there was no confusion about where racism was, to being in a space where, how do you know where it is if people are telling you that it's gone, but the people who were causing it are still here? So I want you to stop and think about this for a second. I've shared this story about my mother telling me about how she found herself at 8 years old sitting at the front of a bus and not realizing that she wasn't supposed to sit at the front of the bus, and the bus didn't move. And then finally, after a few minutes, she realized that the bus wouldn't move because she made the mistake of sitting in the front of the bus. That would go on to shape her mindset about what it meant when somebody basically tells you that your body is not as important as others, and you need to know what your place is because we will respond accordingly to let you know. That was the experience of what it was like growing up in the 40s and 50s and the 60s for Black people. There was no mistaken or confusion about where the line of demarcation was. So I understood what it was when my mother is explaining to me about how when my grandparents were working in various capacities, like my grandmother was a domestic, and she would have young people who were younger than her referring to her by her first name. But she couldn't say anything because in the Black community, you don't ever address your elders by their first name. But because she was being viewed as someone who was lesser than, she often found herself being around a lot of younger white people who would utilize that in that capacity. This is what they were used to. So you can imagine, my grandparents were used to growing up in this particular period of time. As I mentioned, my grandfather served in the military, World War II, and was in a segregated military. So you're talking about people who had grown up in that period of time where they were used to this. There was no confusion. So they were able to raise their kids, my parents, my mom, and my uncles in this particular environment. So they grew up in a world where they clearly knew that if you didn't move a particular way, or if you didn't move consistent with what the laws and the culture at the time dictated for Black people, you were going to get a response. And there was going to be no confusion about the response. You were going to clearly be told, this is the way it is. You need to know your place. Sit in the back of the bus, go walk in the side entrance. And oh yeah, we can use words against you like the N-word, and you can't do anything about it. This was their experience coming from the 40s, 50s, and the 60s. But juxtapose that, love using that word, put that against what it meant to be Black Generation X. We were not coming up in that world. When we were coming up in a world where there were no Blacks-only signs or whites-only signs or color people signs. We grew up in a world where we could go in equally. That same place that my friends went into, my white friends went into, I could go right behind them in that same place. The same establishment we would go to go eat, we could sit at the table together. We grew up at a time period where when we were in class, we didn't look at having Black friends or white friends. We were all friends. And this was a very different experience from what our parents went through. So imagine what that means. Well, what that means now is, unlike our parents' generation and our grandparents' generation, where there was no confusion about where we were and there was no confusion about how racism was at the time, we were in a space where we were told optimistically that as a result of all of the pains and the strides of what the tribulations that they went through, we should not expect to go through those types of trials and tribulations. And that was the world that we were ushering in. But the reality is, which was no way for us to know and no way for our parents to know, is there was confusion because we didn't have a clue as to when racism would manifest itself. Because in our parents' generation, our grandparents, they always knew that anytime you walked into any space, sat down in any establishment, bigotry, discrimination, racism was going to happen. That was the culture at the time. But for us, we had no way of knowing not only what we were going to see, but we had no clue as to what it would look like. So take stock for this example for a minute. When I was in college, and I've shared this before, I attended the University of Tampa, and at the time it was roughly about 95% white. And I remember going into the cafeteria, and at the time, at any given point in time, at the cafeteria during lunch or dinner, you'd have anywhere probably roughly between 100 and 200 students at the time just eating. It was not uncommon during that time period for Black students, Latino students, Asian students, we would all sit at our respective tables. And like I said, it wasn't a lot of us. So when you're sitting there in a cafeteria full of about 150, 200 students, there would probably be about 10 to 15 Latinos, 10 to 15 Asian, 10 to 15 Black students. And we'd all be sitting together. And I can remember one time, one of my classmates, my white classmates, asked me the question, hey, I always notice that when you come in here, you go over there and you sit with your Black friends. Why are you guys segregating yourself? And I had to pause because I didn't know how to respond to that. Because in my mind, I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, there's only about 10 to 15 of us here at any given time. There's only about 100 of us on a campus of about a good 1,500, 2,000 students. Why must we not be allowed to sit with each other? And see, this is an example of what's referred to as kind of a microaggression. This is one of those things where something is said to you in a manner that gives the appearance of being harmless, but is actually causing harm at the same time. Because in this instance, what he's effectively telling me is you have no right to sit with your peers who look like you. You would think ill of me if I did just that. But that's exactly what you were doing, because when you're in a room and there's 100 people and only 10 are Black and maybe 10 are Latino, 10 are Asian, well, guess what? The remaining 70%, 70 people in there are all white. So you're all sitting together. But what you're also signaling to us is that we don't have a right to sit with each other. We have a responsibility to sit with people who don't look like us. But the fascinating part was that when he's asking this question, I don't know, or I didn't know if he genuinely thought he knew he was saying something wrong. Because it didn't dawn on him to say, you know what, you guys are sitting over there. Can I come sit with you guys? Or can we come sit with you? We're like, yeah. But what he was doing was he shifted it to imply that we had an affirmative duty to sit with others who don't look like us, as opposed to merely assembling with other people who look like us. Again, this is one of those situations where you're being put in a position where you're dealing with someone who is legitimately saying something that they believe is harmless and that they believe is a legitimate question, not even acknowledging or even wrapping their brain around how harmful it is what they're asking. And this is what I would call the introduction of this concept of being the others, because effectively what they're telling us is you other people are acting differently. All of the white students are sitting with each other, but you're choosing not to sit with us. So you're the one that's doing something wrong, as opposed to saying, hey, like-minded people, like-attitude people, people who have same shared cultural experiences may gravitate towards each other and assemble. There's nothing wrong with that. Hey, we would love to be able to learn from those. Is there a way that we can get you guys to intersperse with us? Or more importantly, we'll come sit with you. That wasn't the case. His question was, why are you guys doing this? Why are you taking this particular action that is perceived as being something negative to us? Not realizing what he was saying was inherently flawed. And for me, it didn't just manifest itself in college. It was in the professional ranks as well. I can still remember this one particular incident where I was talking to this white older gentleman and something had happened within the black community and he asked my opinion about it and I gave my opinion based on the nuances of the circumstances that I was aware of. And he turns to me and he says, you know what? I'm very disappointed that you as an educated black man has that perspective. I would expect more from you from that. Now, look at what he just said. In that one context, he's trying to use his position as someone older who believes he's more wise and learned to communicate to a younger individual, because I think he was in his 40s, I was in my 20s. And he's literally telling me as a white man, I am projecting onto you my perspective as to the appropriate intellectual response from a black man with regards to this topic. You are not doing so as someone who I have viewed as being both educated and black, and therefore you are wrong in your perspective. The fascinating part was he's not black. He wasn't educated in terms of the same way I was, nor did he have my experiences. But imagine when you're in your 20s and you have someone who you view as being a professional, in particular with a certain amount of experience, basically telling you that you are disappointing them. First of all, he is already accepting this position of being in a position of greater enlightenment than me, to be able to confer upon me that I know black people, I know educated black people, and educated black people that I know, based on my experiences, would not have had the response that you had. Very disappointed. So not only was he basically trying to shape the narrative of effectively telling me what a person he's projecting on me should act in terms of acting and conducting themselves, but he's also denigrating me for not meeting that expectation. That means he's trying to tell me he is in a position to be able to establish that expectation. I have a responsibility to live up to that expectation, but I don't. But this was the kind of experiences that we had that neither our parents or our grandparents could have prepared us for. Here we are in a space where I am with white Latinos in a multicultural space, and I'm dealing with a professional who legitimately probably thinks in his world. Now, let's just be clear, at his age, he probably knew what he was doing. But what he did was he literally did not care that he was causing harm by, one, projecting this level of expectation and conducting himself as if he is in a position as being the arbiter of what an appropriate response from an educated black man is, by not even being an educated black man himself, as a white man thinking it was okay for him to project accordingly. The reality is that this was a new kind of racism. Not only that we have to experience it, but we had to prepare future generations for it. Why was this important? Because one, these types of racism weren't the kind that our parents experienced. They may have experienced it to some degree as the transition occurred, but they had already built up a level of battle-testedness based on what they had gone through before. But the reality is that we were experiencing this for the first time. Microaggressions were emotional landmines because we had to go through the mental gymnastics of figuring out, are they being racist? Are they being bigoted? Are they being biased? Are they just being ignorant? And then we had to navigate, how do you properly respond to this in such a way to let them know this is not acceptable and therefore it's not appropriate for them to approach us in this particular manner. And then we also had to recognize, how do we not hold on to this for the harm that it's caused us so that we don't perpetuate this in the future? And more importantly, how do we learn from this to prepare for future generations? Now, I can tell you now that in the current era, we have more than enough people out here who can talk about what it means to go through and experience microaggressions from their colleagues and so forth. The reality is, for us, like Generation X, and some of the baby boomers who had to endure some of that transition as well, this was all new territory. We didn't know this, and we didn't have anybody who could really prepare us for this, because overt and express racism, we had plenty of veterans who could tell us about that. But this whole new type of subtlety, nuance, microaggressions was something that was so new, the only way we could learn from it was to experience it. One of the things that I often talk about is this delayed awareness. Whenever we see certain things, and this is another part of this whole journey, if you stop and you think about George Floyd, it was devastating to watch what happened to him. But think about the number of people who were only aware to something that had been an ongoing issue in the Black community and respond accordingly. There have been so many people who have tried to tell Black people that what they've been going through, they didn't really go through what they're going through. And as such, tried to convince them that the experiences that they had, the microaggressions, all of these things was merely a form of paranoia, thus perpetuating the violence and harm against them, because you're basically telling them that what you're feeling is not what's real. Until this happened, and all of a sudden people are like, we didn't know. Well, we had been trying to tell you, but you didn't want to hear us. This was kind of the nuance of what was happening for Black Generation X as it was coming into this new multicultural society, where we're basically being told on one end to be optimistic because we had now arrived, not realizing that there were a lot of people who didn't come with us. As such, we had to navigate this space, figure out what the emotional landmines were, deal with the microaggressions, figure out where these new forms of racism are so that we could prepare ourselves going forward and prepare future generations to be able to know what to look out for. This was our new reality. And I think it's important for people to recognize that Black Generation X was the one who literally, just like the generation that came in after the Civil War, we had to usher in this new way of how people would engage us, and the good and the bad and the ugly that came along with it.